Good morning, friends, chess players, and welcome back. It's time for another session on middle game strategy. And today we're going to look at another couple of rules you can follow. We call these three rules the three Fischer rules. I don't really know if the credit should go to Fischer, but he certainly applied them. In fact, the game we're looking at today is actually a Fischer game. However, let's say the attribution was probably arbitrary. Grandmaster Smirnov assigned these three rules to him. I don't see why we should take this away from him, since Fischer definitely followed and applied these three rules. Absolutely. In this game we're about to look at, which starts with the Spanish opening, so finally, we're also seeing a Spanish, so up to this point, right? It's all theoretical, we're still in the opening moves, so I won't reveal these three rules to you yet. Let's go a bit further. So, main line with a 6, bishop to a 4, knight to f6. And at this point, white decides to go into the main lines by castling short. We know that this move has often been played. Recently, the move d3 has also been played, which is, in quotes, a secondary move, but it gives white the opportunity to avoid well-trodden paths while still staying within the realm of the Spanish opening. So if you want to play the Spanish opening with little theory, I definitely recommend you to study the move d3 in more depth here. In the game, the main line is played with short castling, bishop e7, rook e1, and at this point b5, bishop b3, d6. All of this is standard theory, and now white, with the move c3, is obviously trying to gain space in the center with d4. So we are absolutely following the plans of the Spanish opening. After short castling and h3, white now goes on to safeguard the knight on f3. Because here, if we push immediately with d4, obviously we have to be careful about our opponent's possibility to play bishop to c4. And so let's say a little prophylaxis with h3. And finally, black reveals his intentions by playing knight to b8. And so we are officially in the Breyer variation. This move may seem strange, but in reality it is one of the strongest variations to play against the Spanish, both today and in the past. Obviously this is a line from 67, so it does have some age to it. But this variation has remained one of the main lines. Why this move? Let's try to understand it. This move, because the knight on c6, let's say, has already done its job. You can see it doesn't have great prospects. So I pull this knight back to b8, trying to give it a better future on the d7 square, and, of course, why not? Then on the b6 square. At this point, Fischer plays d4, knight to bd7. And here begins the first deviation from the main theory, because Fischer tries to sacrifice a pawn by playing knight to h4. At this point, let's say, obviously black could immediately capture the pawn with this tactic, knight takes e4. And after that, let's say black recovers the knight on f5. However, I imagine that black was definitely scared by the possibility of white playing knight to f5. So, by sacrificing the pawn, white now has a very interesting game. Whenever he wants, he can take the pair of bishops, and obviously here you have to be careful about the threat. Bishop to d5. So let's say black was probably scared to go into the variation with knight takes e4. And here he made his first mistake. So let's immediately state the first rule. Don't exchange pieces when you gain nothing from it. This rule is of great import. Incredible importance, because it's a mistake we all make, and it's a mistake that gets repeated over and over again. Because especially beginner players have this magnetism towards exchanging pieces and simplifying the position. Because in some way, beginners see a simplified position as one that's easier to handle, and obviously that's not the case. It's not a good thing to do, because if the position doesn't require exchanges, we shouldn't make them. So in particular, we shouldn't exchange when we gain nothing from it. In this case, by capturing the pawn on d4, we gain absolutely nothing. In fact, on the contrary, we give white the chance to free up important squares for their pieces and take control of the center. I'll show you the same theme in an even more eloquent way in the French defense advanced variation. This is the advanced variation, and we all know it's played like this, c5 and c3. This is the pawn structure of the French advance. Here, a huge mistake would be to get impatient and immediately capture the pawn on d4. Because this is a mistake, because white simply recaptures, and white's center remains untouched. But now white has gained important squares for their pieces, especially the c3 square. Remember that in the French, one of the problems, specifically in this variation, is the placement of this knight, because this knight can't go to c3, but at this moment it can't even go to d2, since d2 blocks the coordination of the queen. And so, obviously here you end up losing the pawn on d4 because the queen no longer defends d4. So you see, in the same position, if I make this kind of exchange, obviously I give my opponent the chance, as you can see, to develop the knight to the most suitable square. And now white doesn't lose any pawns because the defense is secured. So here perhaps the idea of not exchanging when there's no reason and when you gain nothing is even more eloquent. Let's continue with the game. C takes d4, knight to b6, knight to f3. d5, because now we're also getting closer to the second rule. After the move e5 and knight to e4. Here is the second rule: neutralize your opponent's pieces on your side of the board. So when your opponent's pieces, like in this case this knight, have crossed the halfway point of the board and have reached our side, let's say it's preferable to try to neutralize them because obviously they're in a very aggressive position and could cause us some trouble. In fact, what move does Fischer play? Knight to d2. So he immediately starts by neutralizing this knight. And again, let's go back to the first rule. What should black do? Take on d2? Don't exchange when you gain nothing from it. Here, black gains absolutely nothing by taking on d2. In fact, he simply removes his strong knight and exchanges it for a rather passive white knight that was even blocking white's own development. Here, what should black simply do? So, he should try to defend the piece or even play f5, trying to maintain the tension. There's no reason for us to capture right away. For example, after f5, if now white makes the mistake in turn, right? Don't exchange pieces when you gain nothing, so he captures on e4. At this point, I can basically capture with this pawn, and here, let's say there are a lot of headaches. Obviously, you have to watch out for the tactic with rook takes e4, but in this position, playing rook takes e4 is quite risky. Clearly, black is being very active with his pieces, and in any case, has opened the f-file. So let's say there are practical risks even in this case, and of course also with the simple move bishop to b7. The concept applies again to white. It's not worth capturing because I recapture with the pawn, and obviously now this pawn gives me a lot of space. Here black goes against the first rule, which is not to exchange when it's not necessary, and plays knight to d2, which obviously is not a correct move. Bishop takes d2, bishop to ef5. And this bishop isn't on our side of the board, but in some way it's still exerting control. Let's say over key squares in our half of the board. And now obviously black wants to continue, maybe by playing knight to c4, bringing pieces into play. For example, if I play bishop to b3, bishop to c3, you see it's not really in my favor because black could push the pawn or play knight c4, you see how the position risks becoming really problematic for white. So here Fischer applies the second rule, which is to exchange the opponent's pieces that are, let's say, controlling your half of the board. So what does he play? Bishop to c2. And at this point, let's go back to the first rule. Should black capture on c2 or not? You all understood correctly. He shouldn't capture on c2 because taking otherwise, exchanging pieces if you don't gain anything is obviously not advisable in this case. Look, if black captures on c2, white activates his queen. On the other hand, here black could have easily defended this bishop. And at this point, if white makes the mistake of capturing, it's black who activates his queen and not white, you see? How can these rules seem trivial? But then they end up changing many aspects of the position. So here black kept making mistakes and even played bishop. After c2, rook to c8. At this point, black wants to play c5, but Fischer calmly first defends the c4 square. And at this point, after knight to d7, he rightly starts to open the lines. F takes e6, rook takes e6. Black plays c5, and finally we arrive at the third rule, which is a bit sugar-coated writing. Pay attention, so pay attention to the possibility of counterplay instead of making a passive defense. Why did I sugar-coat it a bit for you? Because we shouldn't be extreme from this point of view, especially when we have a passive position. Active defense is wrong because if we don't have the dynamism to support an active defense, a counterattack, we really end up badly. In this case, white is still very active, and for this reason, in this position, it's likely that there will be active counterplay. So here, you see, if I exchange this pawn, first rule, exchanging is wrong if we don't gain anything from it. Here, black captures with the knight, opens the file, and attacks the rook. So here, instead of capturing passively, let's try to see if we have active counterplay, and the answer is yes. Bishop to a5, active counterplay. We attack the queen, and in this way, we can capture on e7, attacking both the knight and the g7 square. Black plays queen to d8, and now do we move the rook or do we once again look for a counterattack? You got it, there is the counterattack. So knight to g5, and after knight to g5, the game ends here, because obviously I'm threatening the h7 square, which basically can't be easily defended because the rook is still on e7, and so it adds even more pressure in this position. It's really nice that in case of g6, there's a tactic to win here, right? Rook to g7, the rook sacrifices itself, obviously, if the king goes here. Now this mate in 2 follows. And if the king instead captures the rook, then knight to e6. And obviously, let's say I go on to capture the queen. So you see how these 3 rules are then applied in a pretty neat way in the middle game. I wanted to share them with you because, in my opinion, they're really helpful. Thank you. These are 3 very interesting rules, especially the first one, because many of you have this quick hand when it comes to exchanging pieces, and I've already explained the theory of exchanges to you, so I've made you understand how sometimes we shouldn't rush to trade pieces, but even more so, to reinforce it, repetition helps. The first rule, which we've attributed to Fischer, is don't exchange unless you gain something from it. Well, thank you for following this lesson as always. If you want to support me, feel free to subscribe. Thank you. I'll be waiting for you in the comments on this channel, and I'll see you in the next videos.